what are the issues that I find with my presentation and with my chapter? I decided to work on custody and prison custody and the effects of the pandemic and the legislation on custody during the pandemic times. But I think that I get into hot water because it's very difficult to detect how this measure affects prisoners, especially because we are moving into a very thin level of the definition between what is legislation, what is by law, and what is management. So I still think that it's relevant for us, if we are looking at democracy, to reflect on what happened in prison, especially because prison started before pandemic with a strong lack of democracy in many different countries in Europe. It's not unknown that both Italy and France were recently condemned for inhuman and degrading treatment in prison before the pandemic. So overcrowding, the limitation of liberties, the compression of democratic and human rights protection in prison are a fact before the starting of pandemic. And the second reason why I think it's relevant for us to reflect on prison is because somehow the condition of the prisoners were reflecting and anticipating the possibility to reduce liberties that we experienced during the pandemic time. But what was difficult for me, looking at the code book and the data collecting, was to find special way of coding that and to find way to detect what changed the condition of prisoners during the pandemic times. I think that the coding that I could use were 308, so visiting isolated persons, but I think that the way in which pandemic affect prisoners was broader than that. So we have the possibility to put targets and prisoners as targets, but what I want to discuss today and ask if it's relevant for all of us to put into the handbook is how the management of prisoner rights and the management of everyday life in prison, it's out of the legislation. And so how the discretionality and the level of discretionality, and I think in this sense, Italy maybe is the reason of my myopia, because we faced an incredibly violation of human rights during the pandemic in prison. It's difficult to detect because it has to be difficult to detect. So it's not just a limit of our way of coding, but it's also a limit because informality is the way and the space of possible abuses. What are the type of measure possible adopted in prison during the pandemic time? So many countries in Europe were facing overcrowding, and overcrowding was a sanitary risk that was difficult to detect. So one type of measure that is not, it is somehow into the data coding, but it's difficult to detect. It's about the reduction of overcrowding through the suspension and delay of time of custody. So we differentiate the access to prison in timing to reduce the number of prisoners that can stay contemporarily inside prison. The second level, it's the difficulties, the concrete difficulties to apply the distancing into prison. The third level, and was the most easy to detect, is to reduce the access to civil society and to families to visit prisoners. So, of course, it's a closed institution, a total institution, if you want to use the words of Goffman, my quote. But the point is, all these measures were adding just a tiny little compression, but it has huge effects in everyday life of prisoner because there was a compression before. So my point is how to work with this material and how to deal with this material that is outside the legislation, but is affecting a lot our main question on exceptionality and the effects of exceptionality. I think that somehow the broadening definition of pandemic as endemic, so the fact that pandemic has different effects and affect different and differently social groups, is a way to approach these differences. Because there were some compression of other rights that are consequent to this type of deprivation, such as the right of education, the possibility to teacher to go into prison or to follow online lesson in prison. There is the difficulty and the right to communicate. So there was a delay in changing the practices to have access to online calls, for example, or to have access to online colloquium. And of course, there is the delay in the access to the fair process because the judgments and the trials were all stopped and the courts were stopped. So one way to explore the affection of prisoners can be working on the limitation of court and trials during the pandemic. And last but not least, the rights to healthcare. So how they're limited to medical healthcare and the possibility to go to the hospital, to move, to have other type of sustain for healthcare can be affected, affect the prisoner. So I think that this type of framework help us a little, but offer us the possibility to reflect on the fragility of working on legislation, especially in institutions in the shadow, such as prison. But I think that similarly, and maybe Christina can say more this afternoon, happened also with the migration custodies and migration institution. There are spaces in which the lack of legislation is a data to take in account, and it's very difficult to work on it. But what I learned from the Italian experience is that even if there was a few bylaws produced by the police management, the highest violation happened in a moment in which there was no peak of contagion, no peak of legislative production, or no peak of changing of measure, because what happened in Santa Maria Capovetere, that maybe you have heard of it, in April 2020, there was a second, well, sorry, I anticipate what has happened. We had 2 waves of protests in Italy in prison. The first one was during the first measures in March 2020, so between the 7th and the 10th of March 2020. But then during Easter, so in April 2020, there was a beginning of a revolt in a small prison in the south of Italy that is called Santa Maria Capovetere. And there was a huge reaction by the internal police. There are 250 police officers on trial now for the violences, because there was an incredible proof that is the video of the violence that was shared by the prosecutor during the trial. So this case, that is probably the most the darkness moment in the history of Italian prison, has not a connection with the legal framework. So what I'm asking, and I'm sorry for my messy presentation, because I prepare another presentation, but then today, listening to all of you, I thought that was more relevant for us to discuss the limits of legislation, but also the possibility to explore the violation of rights through other instruments. So my question is, what we want to do with this material, if we want to follow other paths, so to use the coding to look at trials as a way to investigate prison or to open to the limits of legislation and move into the space of informality. So I'm sorry again for my messy presentation, but I changed my idea this morning.